Hello and welcome. Thank you for logging on and attending today's virtual program. My name is Matt Schumann. I'm on the programming team here at Cary Library. I'm co-hosting with Mina Jain, the head of the programming team, who will appear later. Before we begin, please let Mina or myself know, oh, there she is, if there are any technical issues that we can try to resolve. And this program is also made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation. With us today is Jonathan Haber, a Lexington-based educational researcher, consultant, and author of Critical Thinking Essentials, published by MIT Press. His book is available everywhere you can buy books, including bookshop.org or your local bookstore. He will demonstrate some of those critical thinking skills today in helping us better understand the news and help us make better decisions. I will now give the floor over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks to the library, not just for kind of making this venue available, but for the many, many hours I've spent there using as my office. I may recognize some faces here from times in the reading room, although my hair was a little less shaggy than it is now. Just want to kind of welcome you and thank everybody for attending. As was just mentioned, my new book, Critical Thinking Essentials, is just out from MIT Press, and it covers concept of critical thinking and also critical thinking in education. So what I want to do in kind of this time is kind of introduce you to the concepts covered in the book, but also show how it can be applied to everyday affairs, including public affairs and political matters, including how to deal with the pandemic. So I think we have a bunch of time blocked off, but I'm definitely not going to be talking for the whole time. So I hope there'll be a lot of chance for questions, answers, and interaction. I think, if you have questions, there's a chat feature, and also there'll be certain points that I'll pause. And if you want to unmute and ask a question, we can have a conversation that way. So with that, I just want to share my screen. It's that sort of momentary awkwardness when people go through the technique. Okay, and kind of get us started, I'll just sort of move the people over here for a little bit. And I think when me and I were working on a title, we were trying to tie it into the pandemic, and I'll be using example, from the current crisis. But I want you to sort of think about critical thinking as something that is applicable to all aspects of life. And just as my background, as which was mentioned, I'm a Lexington resident. I've been living here for more than 13 years. I've also been working in the field of education, a project that you may have heard about. It sort of was in the Globe and other places, was my Degree of Freedom project, which involved working with massive open online courses. I actually took 32 of them in 12 months to see if they really were the equivalent of a college degree. That project led to my first book for MIT Press, which was on MOOCs, on massive open courses for their Essential series. I've also written a book previous to the current one on critical thinking called Critical Voter, that used election politics to teach critical thinking skills. And most recent book is also in the MIT Essential series called Critical Thinking Essentials. And this one is designed really to dispel a series of key myths that I'm contending or arguing have kept critical thinking from playing a more prominent role in education, which is a focus of the book, but also just in society more widely. Okay, and those three myths are that we don't know what critical thinking is, right? We lack a definition, and this lack of a consensus definition is keeping the critical thinking project from moving forward, either as an educational initiative or for making more headway in the sort of general way we discourse on issues of the day. More on the focus on education is there's a myth that we don't know how to teach critical thinking. At the end, I expect there's some educators here who may be thinking about, how critical thinking can be taught, and there is a better understanding of that than people might think. And one topic that's covered in the book, I won't be covering in quite as much detail, is how critical thinking skills can be evaluated to show that learning is improving. My background is in professional assessment, so I've got some expertise in that. So if there's questions later, we can cover that. But focusing on where critical thinking came from and how it is defined. I mean, to begin with, critical thinking draws from a number of disciplines, some of them quite ancient, right? I'd say if you're talking about logic, or you're talking about sort of rhetoric, persuasive communication, you're really talking about Aristotle. So, the roots of critical thinking go all the way back to 2,500 years of ancient Greek philosophy. But it also draws quite a bit from science, particularly early science of when the scientific methodologies and philosophy and science were sort of much more of a sort of merged discipline. So science is another area that critical thinking draws from. Now, there's a critical thinking researcher called Emily Lai who points out that sort of philosophy and science, those help sort of determine how we should think, what the best quality thinking would look like. But there are other fields, notably psychology, that talk about how we actually think, how people actually think and process and reason. Education is a field where we're understanding how people learn. And then most recently, cognitive science, with the ability to sort of peer into the brain and other explorations. These all sort of show not how the ideal forms of thinking function, but how we can jibe the ideal forms of thinking with how people actually think in the real world. Okay, now, the notion that there exists this form of thinking that is so unique and distinct from things like intelligence and wisdom that can be called critical, while it may draw from fields that are, as much as 2,500 years old, the concept itself of critical thinking actually has an origin point. Okay, it can be traced to 1910, and it can be traced to one person, John Dewey, who many of you may know was probably one of the most important American intellectuals of the 20th century, particularly in areas of education. The whole concept of progressive education really draws from the work of Dewey, and Dewey himself drew from a certain branch of philosophy called pragmatism, which, at a paper I gave at the APA, the American Philosophical Association, I talked about the pragmatic origins of critical thinking, which I won't get into detail now. But fundamentally, Dewey sort of refracting some of this information came up with a definition of what he called reflective thinking. And reflective thinking for Dewey was active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of grounds that supports it and the further conclusion to which it tends. This was the first definition of what came to be known as critical thinking. As I mentioned, Dewey referred to it as reflective thinking, but very quickly it sort of took on the name of critical thinking. There have been many definitions since then, over a dozen or so I reflect on in the book. And I think the origin of this notion that we don't know what critical thinking is that there is reasonable debate within the critical thinking community as to what an adequate definition would be. The reason I sort of claim this is not a debate that should paralyze us in the sort of critical thinking project is that these varieties of definition, while interesting on the part of researchers, they really all sort of zero in on the same structure. And fundamentally, that is a three-part model. That's a model that says critical thinking is an interconnected set of knowledge, skills, and dispositions. And I'll get into what of these are in a second, but just to give you an example of how these interconnect, right? One of the key critical thinking skills is structured thinking or logic. No surprise there. Okay, but in order to utilize logic as a critical thinking, one, you have to have knowledge of some logical system. Now, this doesn't have to be any particular logical system. It could be formal or informal logic. It could be symbolic logic. It could be some of the ways of diagramming arguments, argument maps or Toulmin diagrams, visual ways of diagramming arguments that are often useful for young learners to master. And any of these sort of systems, you don't have to have a PhD in them to be able to utilize them. But you have to know what they are. You have to know the rules of logic in order to apply logic to critical thinking. But knowledge alone of one of these logical systems isn't enough. You have to be skilled at the use of it. And skill only comes through practice, right? The rules of logic are actually relatively straightforward, easy to learn, but hard to master, particularly when you're dealing with logical arguments that may take the form of complex editorials or political speeches or ads, right? So you need to apply logic in many different situations in order to get skilled at it, okay? And you also need certain dispositions, notably the desire to think logically about a situation, right? This is a disposition to have faith that logic and reason is the best way to get into answers, as opposed to believing what you're told or believing what you've always believed. So you need the disposition to not just apply logic, for instance, when you're critiquing somebody else's argument, i.e. somebody you disagree with, but also when critiquing your own beliefs, your own arguments. So that's why these three pieces together kind of form the basis of nearly every definition of critical thinking. There may be some debate as to which knowledge and which skills and which dispositions belong in these buckets and how those terms are defined. But fundamentally, this thinking of critical thinking as this set of interconnected skills is enough to move us forward. Okay, and a set of skills that I would like to propose, the fundamental building blocks of critical thinking, and this is just not my belief. And researching the book, I had to look at kind of all the various definitions and debates between people as to kind of what falls where. And these are ones where there really is a consensus agreement. There's probably some debate what role creativity plays in critical thinking. That's an interesting debate, but not one that sort of we need to dwell on by just pointing out that fundamentally, anybody who teaches critical thinking, anybody who works in the field, sort of is in fundamental agreement that critical thinking consists of logic. I refer to structured thinking so that people don't think there's one form of logic you have to master, but you cannot leave your thinking unorganized. Some way you need to structure your thinking, and the ways to best do that are the rules of logic. Okay. You also need to have certain language skills. I mentioned before an editorial, okay, or a political speech or an advertisement. Okay, these are conducted in real world language, right? We're not machines, we're not robots, we're not Vulcans who talk in sort of programming code. We talk in real world language, like the sort of arguments I'm presenting to you are natural language. So we need the skills to translate those editorials, those speeches, those ads into structured statements that fit the format of a logical argument. Okay, and that's where argumentation comes in, which is a major component of critical thinking. Argumentation is what I'll be doing when I show you an example in a second, but that's what we're doing when we're trying to persuade one another or persuade ourselves, that to believe something. Okay, and as I'll show you in a moment, there's sort of rules you can apply to determine if arguments for or against certain beliefs are strong or not. One also needs some background knowledge. There's another, I consider, sterile debate over whether teaching critical thinking in school is taking away time and resources needed to teach students content. The reason I think it's a sterile debate is critical thinking is not separate from content, it's integral to content. You can't think critically about a subject you know nothing about. If you don't know anything about the rules of supply and demand, you can't really have an argument about economics. You don't know the difference between Sunni and Shiite Islam. You can't really discuss the Middle East. Okay, so those are all subjects that are require background knowledge. And I would also add that if you want students to retain background knowledge, then the best way to do that is to give kids something to do with that knowledge. And one of the best things to do with it is to learn how to use it to think critically. Persuasive communication, this sort of ties to language skills. Many of the arguments we're facing are not just sort of logic and reasons. They're sort of presented in ways designed to persuade. We need to be able to see through that rhetoric in order to get to the sort of logical argument beneath. And as I just mentioned, sort of dispositions play a crucial role. I would say one of the most important roles they play is in controlling for biases, particularly the biases that prevent us from accepting information that doesn't jibe with what we already believe. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of how all these rules apply. But before I do, I guess if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask them, or if somebody has a question in the chat, I can answer that now, or I can continue and we'll have plenty of time at the end for more Q&A. Any questions so far?
Not seeing any in chat.
Okay. As I said, there'll be plenty of time at the end for more questions and discussion. So going once, twice. Okay, let's get on to an example. And here's one that is, probably some form of it, some variant on it is going to be familiar with everybody on this call, right? I'll read this. This is a statement somebody's making that, we've been holed up in this house for months, going stir crazy, and the number of deaths from coronavirus keeps going up. Clearly, social distancing isn't working. Okay, this is a statement, as I said. We probably heard more sophisticated versions of it or more nuanced versions of it as we've been sort of dealing with the crisis and when is an appropriate time to start opening up society, start opening up the economy, what systems should we have in place in order to do so. This is a sort of simpler version of the argument, but it's one I want you to sort of think about for a second, because my guess is the first instinct people have reading this is they're going to immediately form an opinion whether it's right or wrong. Okay, and so a step I would like you to take in this case is to hold that opinion in bay. I'm not going to say to ignore it because, once something's in our head, it's very hard to push out. But we can control for it. We can temporarily say, I'm going to give this argument, even if I strongly disagree with it, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to give it enough credence to think about it. Or if you agree with this argument, you are going to take some time to think, well, but maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm wrong about disagreeing with it. Okay, so that's the first step, is to sort of approach it with an open mind. Okay, now the next step is, this argument is clearly, not written in a structured way, right? There's an emotional component to it. There's, clearly it's a sign of frustration. I think there's signs of frustration here probably most of us could empathize with, even if we don't fully understand or agree with it. Okay, but in order to analyze this argument logically, the first thing we have to do is kind of strip it of anything that is not a premise leading to a conclusion of an argument. So here's what a structured argument looks like, okay? In this case, a structured argument includes things called premises, which, anyone who's had logic before will understand. Premises are the things I am asking you to accept as true. Okay, and the conclusion is another statement that I'm saying you should or must accept as true if you accept my premises. Okay, so in this case, I'm saying there's two premises. That argument I just showed you translates to this structure with two premises. One premise is that harsh social distancing practices have been in place for months. The second premise is during that time, the number of deaths from coronavirus has gone up. The conclusion I'm saying you should or must believe if you accept my premises is that harsh social distancing practices have not stopped the spread of coronavirus. Okay, this is a translation of this. Okay? And when you're translating, this is a skill. In fact, this is probably a much harder skill than the sort of rules of logic because human discourse is so widely varying and complex, right? So there are sort of algorithms one you can use to sort of check logic, but to go from real world language to clearly structured statements, it's more, an art. And while, an art you get better at this through practice, there's a few rules of thumb. Okay, one of which is your translation should be accurate, right? You should not translate somebody's argument in a way that doesn't capture exactly the key point someone else is trying to make. And here I strip this argument some of its emotional content, I'm still capturing the key points that the argument's making in the premises and the conclusion. Okay, a second very vital thing is your argument should be charitable. And by charitable, I mean you should create the strongest version of an opponent's argument, right? I could easily have translated this argument into a parody if I didn't agree with it, okay? But in this case, the rule of thumb is you should translate in such a way that you can hand this translation over to the person who made the original argument and ask, did I get it right? You know, does this capture what you're trying to say? And even if, you know, you're translating argument from an editorial in the New York Times or the President of the United States, they're probably not going to answer your email, you know, did I translate it right? But that should be your goal, okay? You should be translating in such a way that the originator of the argument would accept that you captured the spirit of what they were trying to say and you presented the strongest version of that argument, because you'd much rather engage with a strong version of an argument rather than create a weaker version, just the same way a sports team gets better by practicing or playing against stronger teams. Okay, so this is our translated version of the argument. It has two premises and a conclusion. And now we want to test if the argument's any good. And the first test we use is a test for validity. Okay, and the test for validity is very straightforward. The test for validity says, if I accept all the premises as true, right? In other words, if I say premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true in this example, if I say both these premises are true, or at least I temporarily accept them as true, do I have no choice but to accept the conclusion as true? If you are left with no choice but to accept that the conclusion is true, then the argument is valid. Okay, now, in this case, it's very easy to accept both premises as true because they're both statements of fact, and they both happen to be true statements of fact, right? Harsh social distancing practices have been in place for months, and during that time, the number of deaths from coronavirus has gone up, okay? These are both true, so it's very easy to get through that first step of validity of accepting the premises as true. But here I will urge that you should still go through this step, even if in your heart of hearts, you know one of the premises is false, or you believe one of the premises to be false. Okay, because the test for validity is one test of an argument's strength. And before we go on to another test that's about the quality of the premises, first you want to find out is, do the premises lead to the conclusion, right? In this case, these premises are true, okay? But can I reject the conclusion even if I accept the premises as true? And the answer in this case is clearly yes, right? Even if social distancing measures have been in place for months and during that time, deaths have gone up, okay? Well, you know, from what all of us know from reading the papers and reports and listening and watching the news for months, is that nobody said social distancing would work immediately, right? We were told it would flatten the curve, meaning it's going to actually lengthen the time that we're dealing with a virus, but it's going to do so in a way that our healthcare system won't be overwhelmed, right? So with that background knowledge in mind, it's very easy to say, okay, the premises are true, but I can easily reject the conclusion, which means this argument is invalid. Okay, this is not a valid argument. This argument fails the test of validity. And the reason I mentioned before of you should put an argument through this test, even if you're not sort of comfortable with some of the premises, is if you could prove an argument is valid, then it doesn't matter if the premises are true or false, right? In this case, the premises are true, but it leads to a false conclusion. Okay, so I'll show you a little bit more what I mean in next step in this, because I've just shown this argument is not valid. Okay, but that may have been because of the way I translated the argument, right? Because hidden in the original argument is a hidden premise, you know, what Aristotle referred to as an enthymeme, which I tend not to use in sort of too much public discourse, but it's the only Greek word I'll use right now. But it's a hidden premise in argument, okay? So I could have translated this argument in a different way. I could translate it using this hidden premise. Now, this version of the argument has the same first two premises and the same conclusion, okay? But it has a hidden premise, one that is not stated explicitly, but I can glean from what the argument says, and that hidden premise is that social distancing practices should lead to an immediate reduction in the deaths of coronavirus. Okay, and if you'll notice here, if I add this hidden premise, this argument is now valid. Okay, if I accept premise 1, premise 2, and the new hidden premise, and I say all 3 of these are true, then there's no way I can accept those 3 premises and reject the conclusion. And as you note here on hidden premises, this is another very key translation skill. Again, I'm not using the most complicated example here, but in many of the debates we have, about serious issues, often they hang on a hidden premise, on an enthymeme, right? Or the debates we have over abortion, the pro-life and pro-choice positions tend to all hang on a hidden premise of whether a fetus is a human being, okay? And so if we could expose what those hidden premises are, we could expose what we're actually arguing over. Okay, and I mentioned before that there's 2 tests of argument quality. The first was validity. The second is the test for soundness. Okay, and if the test for validity said I'm automatically accepting all the premises as true and seeing if they lead to conclusion, with the test of soundness, you take back your acceptance of the premises, okay? You say, now I'm going to test each premise to see if that premise is true, or at least if it's something a reasonable person could accept, okay? And in this case, I've already stated the first 2 premises are statements of fact, right? Those are true, those are easy to accept as true. But the third premise, my new hidden premise, that one's easy to reject, for the same reason that last argument was invalid. This just builds that sort of weak reasoning into a premise as opposed into the structure of the argument itself, right? It's easy to reject the notion that social distancing practices should lead to an immediate reduction in deaths from coronavirus, because we know, as I just said, the whole point of distancing is to flatten the curve, which means it's going to lengthen the time, not shorten the time, but it's going to limit the number of cases at any one time. So this version of the argument also fails, and it fails due to a lack of soundness. Now, very often it is actually useful when you're going through the translation process to purposefully translate an argument so that it is valid. And one of the reasons it's useful to do that is when you are trying to create a valid argument that has problems, you are usually forced to construct the premises in such a way that the weaknesses of the argument will be exposed, right? I did nothing uncharitable when I added this new hidden premise, right? This could be immediately distilled from what the original argument said, okay? But by forcing my argument into a valid structure, I was able to come up with that hidden premise, and that is the sort of Achilles heel of the argument. Okay, this argument fails because of the sentiment, whether built into the reasoning of my first version of the argument or built into an actual premise of the second version of the argument, reflects faulty reasoning. Okay, so that's an example of how we can apply all of these sort of principles, components of critical thinking to a actual real world situation, right? I apply the rules of logic, okay, to an argument that had to be translated from real world discourse into structured statements that form the premises and the conclusion of an argument, right? Obviously, I'm dealing with argumentation, and I used the rules of logical argumentation to prove that this argument is either invalid or if valid is unsound. Either way, I could show the argument failed. I was able to do that because I had background knowledge, right? I understood what the whole concept of flattening the curve was all about, right? That's knowledge, that's background knowledge that allowed me to reject an argument or reject one of its premises, okay? And while persuasive communication didn't play a large role in this, I would say certainly reading that argument, one may have empathized. I think probably we all empathize with the frustration of being under sort of lockdown for now growing on a couple of months. Okay, so I think, if that argument, poor though the reasoning is, had or has persuasive power, as versions of it do in public discourse now, it's because it's sort of appealing to a perfectly legitimate feelings we have about sort of frustrations over feeling trapped. Okay, but also, remember I talked about dispositions, and at the very beginning I asked you to put aside your initial embrace or dislike of this argument. Like, avoid immediately saying, oh, that argument stinks. It's wrong. I disagree with it. I don't have to go any further. Okay, I already completely disagree with it. I'm done. Or I already completely agree with it. I'm done. And there's two reasons you should sort of reject that instinct. First of all, it's when arguments get more complicated than the one I used in this example, as arguments do, as most arguments are more complicated than ones I created specifically to illustrate these concepts, right? You have complex arguments that are made up of many smaller arguments that branch and chain in many directions. Okay, and if you're not ready to sort of apply these rules on simple arguments, and just because you just trust your intuitions, right? Your intuitions probably told you there's something wrong with that argument. But your intuitions are more likely to fail when you're dealing with more complicated arguments, unless you master these skills for the simpler cases, and then you could build them up and apply them to more complex cases. So that's one reason to sort of not sort of immediately go with your instinct, your gut instinct, but to actually go through these steps. Another reason to do it is it can strengthen your beliefs, right? In this case, I, like many of you, probably had a problem with that argument just from reading it, okay? But having gone through this analysis, I now have reasons to reject it. I could explain to maybe somebody who accepts it, or maybe somebody who accepts a version of it, why that argument is wrong. And really, that's what critical thinking is. It's having reasons for belief. Okay, it's having what philosophers call warrant, the thing that connects premises to a conclusion, things that connect facts to conclusions, right? I talk about this a lot in conjunction with the news and fact-checking the news, right? If somebody tells you we've had like 3 cold winters, so global warming is false, right? Presuming we've had 3 cold winters, fact-checking doesn't get you anywhere, right? There's no problem with the facts, presuming they're true, just like there was no problem with the premises of my argument. The problem was a failure of warrant, a failure of the premises to provide enough reasons to believe the conclusion. Okay, and now that I have reasons to believe that my coronavirus argument is bad, okay, I have been able to rest my instinctive belief on reason. So therefore, they're far stronger. They're on a much stronger foundation. But I may have discovered I'm wrong. Okay, going through this process may reveal to you that things you thought were true are not, or maybe are things you should question or explore more deeply. And that's what sort of discourse and argumentation should be all about, right? We should be open to the beliefs of others. We shouldn't sort of dismiss beliefs just because they're not shared by members of our community or our belief system. We should scrutinize them, we should argue them, but we should be open and charitable to them. And through argumentation, we may find, one possibility is the things we believe rest on a very strong foundation we didn't realize was there. Or they may rest on a very weak foundation, which we never thought about because we haven't really considered them before. Okay, so these are the kind of components of critical thinking. I will kind of open up to questions before sort of talking a little bit about education. I don't want to dwell too much on this. This is what I sort of cover when I'm talking to teachers. But again, if there's any questions in the chat or anybody has a question they want to unmute themselves, I'll be going through sort of one more section on education, then we'll just open up the floor generally for discussion. But any questions between now and then?
Matt had a question about how to use these skills if you're in conversation with somebody who doesn't have those skills.
Excellent question, right? And I'd say, probably we should presume, most people you're in discourse with don't have these skills, because most people don't have these skills, right? That's why I'm such a big advocate for including them, or really re-including them in education, right? I'd say even people who are highly expert, highly educated, and have vast knowledge about certain subjects, many of them don't sort of understand or live by these rules of critical thinking because it's a set of skills, right? I think, there's a set of dispositions called, one is intellectual humility, is sort of understanding, you yourself may not know everything. Okay, be able to sort of understand that you yourself have things to learn and skills to develop as a critical thinker. But you also have to have intellectual courage. If you have come to believe something and really have gone through a process like this one to understand why, you should be able to stick to those beliefs. Now, I think the question is if you're engaged with somebody who may not have these skills, well, to extent we all, have or lack them to certain degrees, right? I think one thing one could do is try to engage in respectful discourse with people, and you may find that even if you may have more training after this session, or you get into this or read my book or do whichever, want to learn more about it, you may be more skilled in it than somebody you're debating with. That doesn't mean that conversation has to stop. It doesn't have to mean you're destined to reach an impasse. It may turn out that you're in a position to guide the conversation in more productive avenues rather than just sort of shut things down. I think another situation that possibly this question was directed at is, what if you're engaged with a conversation with somebody who does not want to think critically about a subject? They have their own dogmatic beliefs, and that's that. They all they want to do is sort of keep repeating the same points at you or whichever. And I guess in that case, obviously, you are in an impasse, sort of discourse. It may, there may be a chance for productive discourse, but it might be futile. I guess, my first suggestion would be don't presume everybody you're interacting with who doesn't agree with you is an ignoramus or is stuck in sort of stubborn dogma. They may actually just have points that you don't want to hear. So I'd say, keep an open mind that reasonable discourse is possible, but don't have an open mind. My mind's so open, your brain falls out, right? There's no debating somebody who's trying to convince you of, the efficacy of perpetual motion machines, crank race theories, et cetera. There's certainly some arguments that are beyond the pale conspiracy theories. But I guess my suggestion is don't assume every argument you don't like has the same qualities as a conspiracy theory. Any other questions? Okay, so I guess I'll kind of wrap up by talking about sort of what we can do in schools, and then also what we could do in our homes or our lives to sort of improve the quality of critical thinking. This gets a little more of the sort of techne of critical thinking education, but this is where I do much of my work, is trying to get critical thinking to be included in education at all levels, K-12 up through higher education. And, a very sort of simple way of understanding it is there are really three methods that critical thinking can be taught at any grade level. And these three come from a researcher named Robert Innes, one of the sort of most well-known critical thinking researchers. He years ago proposed three different kinds of critical thinking and suggested that we perform research in order to determine which ones work the best. One is called general approach, and the general approach you see mostly in higher education, at least in the US, where you might have a standalone critical thinking course, right? Many colleges and universities have standalone critical thinking courses. And that's where you go to learn about critical thinking. And they may pull from all kinds of examples in the news and science, et cetera. But the point of the course is to learn critical thinking skills. Okay, so that you have a sort of subset of higher ed that does that. Then you have something called immersion, which is regular subjects are taught, be it math or science or college level psychology or whichever. And the assumption is critical thinking is taught implicitly, right? This is the bulk of how critical thinking is taught in the world, right? That a smart teacher or a very skilled teacher teaching kids complex subjects, they are assuming that critical thinking is coming along for the ride, right? And in fact, if you ask most teachers, they would say they not only do they think teaching critical thinking is important, they would say, and I am doing it. And what they're really doing is they're following the immersion method, which is they're teaching the subject matter, assuming critical thinking content is implicit in the subject matter. That's in contrast to what's called an infusion method. An infusion method is critical thinking is still folded into the teaching of other content, be it English, math, science, whatever, but it's taught explicitly. Okay, the example I like to use is a math teacher. When they teach how to perform geometric proofs, they're actually teaching deductive reasoning, which is that's what we did in that example I used. That's a very important logic component, very important critical thinking skill. Okay, and that's what a mathematical proof is, it's deductive reasoning. Okay, the immersion method would say students will just understand deductive reasoning from seeing that proof, learning about how to do geometric proofs. The infusion method would say the math teacher stops and says, that was an example of deductive reasoning. Here's what deductive reasoning is. Okay, and here's how you can apply deductive reasoning to other subjects in math and to subjects outside of math. And maybe they take it further and say, and that it's contrasted with inductive reasoning, which is the primary form of reasoning used in science. Okay, so those are the three methods for teaching critical thinking. And as I mentioned, Enos recommended that this be the subject of research. And in fact, over the next 20 years, there was extensive research which seemed to bear out, social science research, so it's not perfect, but it seemed to bear out that the worst way to teach critical thinking is through immersion. Okay. Oh, yes, Mina?
We do have a question from Edward Dolan.
Yep.
K through 12, are there some good examples of systems where this is taught well and extensively, and are there bad examples where it is notably neglected?
I'd say the examples where it's notably neglected is pretty much everywhere, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily neglected because teachers and educational systems don't want to teach critical thinking. As I said before, if you ask teachers, college professors, administrators, educators, they would say, critical thinking is our top priority. I think 99% of college professors say it's our top priority. And they also say I'm doing it. I'm doing it right now. The trouble is if you survey employers, 75% of them say the kids who have graduated from all this schooling and all this exposure to teachers who think critical thinking is great can't do it. Okay, so if you think of it like I do, the glass is half full, right? Everybody's on board. Everybody wants kids to think critically, or just about everybody. Teachers want to do it. They're just not necessarily using the best methodology. They're using the immersion methodology. They're assuming critical thinking is learned by osmosis. Okay, and an example of a place where it did work really well, there's a project in the UK called the P4C, Philosophy for Children. This is where very young learners, elementary school learners, were taught philosophy. Actually, they engaged in philosophical discussion debates at the elementary school level. And that one is where these skills were taught explicitly, right? It was an infusion method. And there, not only did the students do well in that course, but they did better in all their courses, English, math, etc. They all improved from being exposed to philosophy. And I think, the underlying reason for that is when you structure your thinking well, it applies well to anything, not just studying more philosophy. There's a lot of work. It's haphazard, but sort of philosophy for children's programs, debate, kind of mock trial, ethics bowl. So there's a lot of activity, some of it extracurricular. And, I'd say if you look at many of the standards, the state standards, particularly newer standards for like science or social studies, they are on board the critical thinking bandwagon. I think really the key reform that I'm sort of advocating is to move from immersion, which is what we're not going to get general critical thinking courses in K-12, right? We're not going to restructure the entire curriculum or replace social studies or math with a critical thinking course, nor should we, right? Because general is the second best, or if you like, the second worst way of teaching critical thinking. Infusion is the best way. So really, we want to reform education. We want to change teacher preparation methods. So some of these explicit methodologies, or what I call high leverage practices, are included in the teaching of the curriculum. And we want to sort of get professional development, get more teachers to understand and use this methodology. So that's sort of, the work I'm doing in education, because it does seem to work, right? It does seem to work that when you, and in a way it's sort of intuitive, right? Why should it seem weird that if you want kids to learn something, you should teach it to them, right? And the people who teach it to them should know something about it. Why should teachers who are super skilled at math and English and science, but may not have been exposed to kind of these critical thinking skills that I mentioned, and don't teach it explicitly, why should that be successful? It's probably not. Okay, so it's just a question of moving the needle, because the good news is any teacher who's sort of good at teaching, math or social studies or science already has mastered a subject much more complex than the skills you need to be a critical thinker. They just have to learn them and put them into practice and build them into their pedagogy. Okay, so that's cool. I'd say there is things we could do ourselves, at home, but really our home being ourselves as individuals or as parents or family members or, members of a society. I think one thing is we can learn this critical thinking toolkit, right? It's general purpose. If you're a teacher, you need to know it in order to teach others. But if you're a human, you need to know it in order to do this. Okay, so that's just one step in the pathway is, put the effort into learning to become a critical thinker and put those tools to use. I think somebody described critical thinking as a skill like playing the piano well or being really good at a sport. It takes 10,000 hours of practice to get really good at it. And I'm not sure if that's true. There's not been sort of studies on it, but I'd say it certainly is true that you can learn the skills in a very short amount of time. I've taught it in a matter of hours, but in order to get really good at it, you must put it into practice, and that could take months, certainly, if not years, of actually putting it into practice. Okay, but a lot of these other things have to do with dispositions, right? We must resist dogmatism, especially our own dogmatism. We have to welcome debate about important subjects, even if it's debate with people we have fundamental disagreement with, right? We should have arguments with people, not fights. And the distinction between argument and fight is an argument is designed to get somebody to change their mind. It's designed to get to people to want to do what you want them to do, as opposed to a fight where you just want people to do what you want and you don't care about changing somebody's mind, right? To engage in argumentation, that is an actual sort of productive process, even if you don't come to an agreement. Versus a fight is just whether it's an actual physical fight or just, the kind of fights we have these days in our political arena where it's all about shouting and not listening, belittling others, sort of burying people in an avalanche of of hostile tweets, et cetera. Those are not arguments. We're not engaging in argumentation. I don't know what we're doing, but they're not arguments. Okay, and these are all examples of demonstrating and practicing critical thinking dispositions, and it's hard to do, right? We often, are surrounded by people who share our fundamental beliefs, certainly our political beliefs, possibly our religious beliefs, other fundamental beliefs, so that we may be, and if we happen to live in those rare communities where our loved ones and neighbors don't all agree already, we can always jump online and find a community that's like-minded to engage with. So we never really have to sort of question our fundamental beliefs. And here, I hope I proved earlier that interrogating your beliefs doesn't mean you necessarily are going to end up rejecting them or are weaker than somebody who clings to their beliefs dogmatically, right? In fact, I would say somebody's beliefs that are backed up by sort of thinking them through, they have a much stronger foundation for beliefs than somebody who just sort of accepts them because that's what they've always believed, or that's what they've been taught to believe, or that's what they should believe. Okay, so you can see some of this in practice. I've got a couple resources here. The first one is just my own website that sort of covers the book and various projects that I've been involved with. Another one is one called logiccheck.net, and that's where these tools I just exposed you to, I've actually been applying them to many of these more complex arguments, right? You know, should the press stop covering Donald Trump's coronavirus press conferences, right? Did Nancy Pelosi plan in advance to tear up Donald Trump's speech at the State of the Union? You know, is the panic over coronavirus more dangerous than the virus itself? These, you know, inherently more difficult, challenging, complex arguments. I use these same tools to kind of analyze those in the same way we looked at that simple argument. So suggest you pop over there if you want to kind of see them. It's a blog, so it's arranged chronologically, but there's also curriculum you could follow if you want to follow it more sequentially. I also created some resources, not specifically critical thinking related, but just for teachers. If you know any teachers who are navigating coronavirus, I'd done this early before everybody and his brother created similar resource packages. So, but it's there if anybody needs it. And I think I'll probably just leave things. So I'll just leave things on this slide if anyone needs to take this down. And I think we've got plenty of time, since I'm happy to stick around as long as anybody likes on that. But at this point, I will open up the floor to either more message-based Q&A, or if everyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, I'll try to answer as best I can.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate your thorough conversation here. I had a couple questions from Matt before he had to leave. From you and from everybody who's participating here, do people have examples of their own experiences of using critical thinking skills or wishing they had?
Excellent question. I give you one example from like home life. Like I haven't covered the full range of skills, but one skill of argumentation has to do with understanding the type of argument you're having. There's 3 types of arguments. One called a forensic argument, which is mostly about the past, a demonstrative argument, which is mostly about the present, and a deliberative argument, which is mostly about the future. And those arguments use past, present, and future tense primarily. Okay, and I won't dwell on it now, but generally the most effective arguments are ones that are about the future, right? Because you could solve things in the future. You lay blame in the past. Okay, so one technique I've used at home is that when I'm kind of mad at somebody in my household, my kid traipses in the house with muddy shoes, I could say, how many times do I have to tell you to stop dragging mud into the house? Okay, that is a forensic statement, right? I am blaming them for doing something and accusing them of having done this a lot in the past. Or I could say, next time, would you mind taking your shoes off before you come into the house, right? That is a deliberative argument. It's future tense. And if you think of the 2 statements, right, how you would respond, I mean, most of us aren't kids anymore, but if somebody sort of told us something in a sort of deliberative, accusatory, blameworthy fashion versus, forensic versus deliberative, future-oriented, recommending ways we can improve things, you can see how more effective the deliberative format is. And so, generally, we've tried our household to pause and take the time in order to sort of frame our interaction with each other, especially when we're angry, in a deliberative fashion. It doesn't always work, we have arguments in the household like any others, but I think this sort of took one aspect of edge off of debates, is that on top of the legitimate things we might be arguing over, we weren't also mad at each other because of the way we were sort of talking to each other. So that's an example of like how these techniques can be used. And I plenty examples of it not being used when I've blown my temper at somebody who, didn't agree with what I said. We all have moments I'm not sort of proud of, and those are moments I didn't stop and reflect and maybe wasn't as respectful of someone else's positions as it could have been. Anybody else have some cases they want to throw out?
Looks like we have a quiet group here, but Dana says, deliberative arguments. Now that's something I can put to work right away. Thanks, John.
No problem, Dana. Dana's a friend. We'll be comparing notes over beers in a couple days. But yeah, that should highlight that, I mean, well, like that logic check, I talk a lot about sort of, political examples, but this is like everyday life is about this, right? My kids is going through the college process now, right? He's going to have to make a decision about what schools to apply to. There are reasons, to choose, logical reasons to choose certain schools over others. But there's also emotional things you need to either account for or control for. Right? There's also biases that are hardwired into our system. Like there's something called the recency effect, where you remember things they were told more recently, you hold those much more strongly than something you held 6 months ago. So when you're putting together your final list, 6 months from now, make sure you're not overly weighing that conversation you had with a kid who goes to a school 2 days ago over, hours of research you put into something 6 months ago. Make sure the recency effect is not sort of blinding you in certain ways. So, these are applicable, to all kinds of decisions. It's not just sort of political beliefs or beliefs over faith, although it is useful not just for that, but also it offers the potential to have actually like civilized conversation and, heaven forbid, actually political discourse where we get somewhere versus kind of where we are right now. I would say, the challenges we're having is, it's not even a sort of challenge of like post-truth fake news, although certainly, those are problems. But I would say, the problem is that we, have lost the ability to argue. We know how to fight, we do that really well, but we don't know how to argue. We don't know how to engage in the productive activity called argumentation. And if we don't figure out a way to do it, things are bad now. They're actually going to get worse. Anything else from anybody?
I see somebody is unmuted. I'm wondering if they have a question. Irvin? Am I? Okay. So one question that's come up is, do you think that social media platforms dampen or invalidate the efficacy of these skills?
I'm glad you asked it that way, because I think I do make a distinction between the internet and social media. The internet, it's such a vast thing. It's like, do we benefit from, the highway system or being able to navigate, water, waterways, the ocean. But I would say where the internet has enhanced critical thinking is in terms of background knowledge, right? We all basically have, 1,000 libraries of Alexandria in our pocket, right? The background knowledge we need is more accessible than ever before, including access to experts and experts who are happy to share, what they know, and are eager to do so, the way I'm sort of eager to share this information with this audience. So in that sense, the internet is good. It's also created avenues for, sources of information that had trouble breaking through gatekeepers before. Right, local news, for example, it may be struggling in terms of local newspapers, but certainly here in Lexington, there's the Mavens list, and there's all kinds of websites to find out what's going wrong. Or water is out in my neighborhood. I didn't have to wait for Thursday for the Minuteman to come out. I could just go online and someone would tell me, yeah, somebody cut the water main on that. So in that sense, it's good, but of course that lack of barrier to entry means any nut with a grudge can talk about any crock they like, online, and it's going to be sort of on par in terms of at least availability with, the New York Times. So that's a mixed bag. Social media, I would say, in terms of discourse, has probably been a net negative. I think it's been very good. It's been great in terms of connecting people, in friends and communities, and certainly there are communities of people on social networks that are there to learn and learn from each other, including critical thinking communities, some of which I'm part of. There's really interesting Reddit thread called Change My View, where somebody throws out a view they believe, but welcomes people to try to change their mind. I've just been sort of playing around there recently. So that's great, but there's large parts of Reddit, like there's large parts of the internet that are cesspools, right? Full of racism and anti-Semitism and dogmatic politics and unexamined beliefs. And I'd say certainly in social media, that sort of tends to drown out volume, like loudness tends to drown out reason. So I'd say in that case, social media has the possibility of doing good, so it's not a total, disaster. But I would say it's, the more I read like news stories in like the mainstream media that start with like so and so said something on Twitter, the more I presume our discourse has degenerated to the sort of Twitter flame war. I tend to be more of a blogger than a Twitterer, so I like discourse that's allowed time to develop, and so communities that sort of are patient and are open to discussion that might go on for more than a paragraph. Those I think are valuable. I think this rush to do things in 140 characters or do it all in a picture, that's probably on the whole detrimental to discourse. Yeah, so I'd say I don't think it's an accident we are politically where we are, also in an age of where social media is where it is.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Can you comment on the current status of the critical thinking education in Lexington school system?
I only know from my older son went through the system, and one of his English electives was philosophy elective, and actually there was a group that taught a form of logic mapping involved with that course in the high school. But that was an elective. That was a sort of senior elective that happened to have this group of people teaching it. So I would say probably Lexington, while it's a very good education system, is probably doing the best it can with the immersion system for teaching that I mentioned before, and that you've got sort of smart teachers, many of whom probably have instincts that if sort of, teased out would sort of translate to kind of critical thinking instincts. So students are doing well. You probably have students who go home and have, sort of discursive debates, and discussions at home that are probably a little more productive than maybe in other communities where there are not so many educators living in the community like Lexington is. But I would say probably Lexington suffers from, the same challenges other communities do, that even the teachers who, are very skilled here, they're terrific, and they know their subject matter very well, but they're just using the wrong methodology, right? They're assuming critical thinking comes along for the ride when you teach algebra or when you teach, writing, right? Because I'm teaching them to argue something out, so therefore critical thinking, they must be learning something there. I'm teaching them, geometric proofs that, I may not be able to put a word on it, but it's deductive reasoning. But as it turns out, unless you sort of spell out, by the way, this is deductive reasoning, here's how argumentation works, that essay fails because it's invalid or unsound. Why should this be any surprise, right? If you don't teach somebody something, why should they learn it, right? It's equivalent. The argument equivalent I say is like, no one would assume we can get rid of math because you have to use math when you're learning physics, right? So why not just bag a separate math class? We'll teach them physics, and they'll just pick up pick up math as doing physics, right? That'd be ludicrous, right? They need to learn mathematics systematically. They need to have the mathematical subjects spelled out. Same thing with critical thinking, right? These teachers who are already teaching argumentation and teaching deductive reasoning have to be versed in pedagogies that say, aha, this is a point where I can teach kids not just, geometric proofs, but I know that that's a form of deductive reasoning. I know deductive reasoning is applicable beyond this one subject. I'm going to use this as a high leverage moment to teach them a critical thinking skill, deductive reasoning. And the good news is they don't have to do that every single day for every single subject. They don't even have to change the way they teach now for the most part. They just have to recognize where these high leverage moments occur and have the knowledge base and the skill set to sort of apply explicit critical thinking instruction to those moments. So I would say, Lexington is doing as well as any school system can do when they're using the wrong methodology.
Thank you.
So if we don't have any more questions in chat, if anybody else has any questions, please speak up or send us a little note, and and Jonathan will definitely answer it. Let's give it a couple more minutes.
Okay, I will stop share so you can see my freaky hair for a few more moments.
I actually have a
winding
question.
down, I just wanted to thank everybody for attending. I know a few people had to kind of drop off at 2, but thank you. I enjoy talking about this. If anybody wants to get in touch, I think I didn't put an email address on, but it's jonathan@degreeoffreedom.org. If you took down those websites, there's contact forms on both those websites. You can contact me if anybody wants to continue the discussion or talk more about any one particular subject. But let me just share those URLs one last time, and very much thank Nina and Carey Library for making this happen. This was a real treat.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Grace did ask that her daughter's going to college this coming fall, and any advice for her?
This coming fall. Well, first, hope it's on campus. That's something we're all figuring out, sort of critical thinking or no. I would urge her to take a logic class. I would urge her to take a philosophy class. If the school has a critical thinking class, great. In some schools it's actually a requirement to take a critical thinking class. So by all means do that. I'd say if you have a choice between a critical thinking class and a logic class, take both, but I'd say, certainly take a logic class. I would explore philosophy, since that's where a lot of this emerged from. And then I would say just sort of generally, maybe over the summer, I think everyone's talking about, what do I do over the summer that's productive, since I may not have a job or might not be able to travel or go to camp or do the things I planned. It's not the worst time to kind of learn to be a critical thinker. There's resources out there. If you write me, I could sort of send you free resources or, books you could read. I think, that would prepare you to have a really more successful career as a college student, rather than sort of waiting 2 or 3 years to sort of pick up these pieces a bit at a time on that. So that's, recommendation, but good luck.
Thank you, Jonathan. This has really been wonderful. And thanks everybody for coming and being part of the discussion. I hope you learned something. I'll send out a little bit of a recap afterwards with the link to this video, and if Jonathan is okay with it, his contact information, if you have any follow-up questions. And thanks. Everybody said, yeah, they're asking for some books and some advice. So we'll continue the conversation on email. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Take care.